Welcome back to Boyd Book Club and Semester 2. This semester we are going to continue to build upon the work that we did in studying Ozinga's texts, Destruction and Creation, and some of Boyd's original briefings by continuing to delve into the OODA Loop, particularly taking a focus on the centrality of orientation. As we examine this, we are going to use two principal texts that need to be downloaded or bought. If you've looked at the syllabus, you know that those are Grant Hammond's The Mind of War and Chuck Spinney's Evolutionary Epistemology briefing. Both of them are easily obtainable. I've provided links in the syllabus for where you can get each of them. In addition, there are going to be some videos or articles that I want you to read as we prep for the work that we're going to be doing. The idea there is that we're going to spend some time digging into the filters of orientation in this semester of studying Boyd's work. And I think that that is the next most important point to go from. Once we have this broad picture view of Boyd, his thinking, where he's going, digging into the filters of orientation and how analysis and synthesis works is our next step in being able to take and apply Boyd's thinking in our own lives. With that said, let's get into the work of Semester 2 in this week's video. So as I mentioned, our two main texts are going to be Chuck Spinney's Evolutionary Epistemology and Grant Hammond's The Mind of War. Some things we want to think about is that Spinney is one of Boyd's original acolytes, and he became the face of the military reform movement. There's quite a few video, like news magazine, as well as print interviews with Spinney about his thoughts on the military reform movement, Pentagon procurement, weapons systems development. All of that is really, really interesting information. It's really worth spending your time on to getting to understand where Spinney is coming from as a thinker in his own right. Spinney's relationship with Boyd stretches back to Boyd's Pentagon years in the Pentagon doing military development. His ongoing relationship with Chet Richards has been a driving force in the continuation of Boyd's work. And in fact, a lot of my thinking about Boyd's work is informed by Chuck's writing and his evolutionary epistemology brief in particular. It's been a hugely seminal brief in expanding my understanding of Boyd and how to apply Boyd's work. So in my opinion, digging into the ongoing work that Chet and Chuck have done, expanding and exploring Boyd's original concepts that they helped develop is really essential. Our second text is going to be Grant Hammond's The Mind of War. And Hammond was a lecturer at the Air War College, and while he was there, he came to know Boyd as a guest lecturer. And their relationship led to an ongoing conversation over the course of about 5 years, where they would speak on the phone for as much as 12 hours a week. Hammond is not a custodian of Boyd's work in the same way that Richards or Spinney are, but he is an advocate of Boyd's work. He is sympathetic to Boyd's work. He recognizes the importance of Boyd's work. And the selections from Hammond that we're going to look at should help continue to illuminate and illustrate Boyd, his methods, and give us the insight of somebody who was a genuine interlocutor of Boyd, an ally of Boyd, but not necessarily a co-worker or in the position that Coram uses of being an acolyte. So I think that that gives us an idea of where we're going to go with this as we examine the changing focus in Boyd's epistemology. I like Spinney's language of evolutionary epistemology because if we think about evolutionary epistemology, what we're talking about is a change over time in our theory of knowledge. So Spinney wants to come back to how this change in our theory of knowledge over time comes to be. Why is this important? Why is this relevant? And for Spinney, it's not enough to say that we are decision makers. We need to address why we make decisions. Boyd addresses this, to be sure. Spinney wants to come back and reinforce this idea. And there is this biological imperative that we have to survive, right? Surviving first and foremost. Secondly, surviving on our own terms. Spinney points out this increased capacity for independent action. What this all says in my language, in the way that I speak about this, is agency. We as individuals want to be agenic beings capable of obtaining those things that we desire based upon our drives for self-improvement, self-development, self-growth, right? This all happens within a particular environment. That environment provides a set of boundaries that we need to deal with. Now, these boundaries are essentially arbitrary, right? In the modern world, the boundaries that we are up against are things like borders when we talk about the environment, or the boundary may be an economic boundary. These are still relatively arbitrary boundaries, but just because they are arbitrary doesn't mean they are not consequential. They place, as Spinney points out here, real-world constraints on our capacity for independent action, right? They limit us. And as a result, the consequence of this is that to survive and grow relatively free of debilitating constraints, individuals and groups must make decisions and take actions to overcome physical obstacles and social competitors. We have to be agenic beings. We cannot simply be a part of the herd if we seek to survive and thrive on our own terms. Within this notion, we need to remain viable and relevant. Spinney points out that our description of reality has to be continuously refined by checking and verifying its internal consistency and reversibility, as well as its matchup with internal reality. I'd like to hearken this back to the language Lawrence Gonzalez uses in his book, Deep Survival. Don't bend the map. What's important to remember is that our description of reality is not reality. Our description of reality is the map. Reality is the territory. And if we look at our image of reality in this way, it helps us take a step back and think about what we're dealing with. When we are orienteering, if we are hiking, if we are skiing, if we are mountain climbing, whatever we might be doing where we are working with a map and compass, if we get confused and forget that the terrain is where we actually are, and instead focus on our perceived and or assumed position on the map is where we are experiencing a lack of matchup with external reality. We may have internal consistency, but we do not match up with reality, and therefore we are not continuously refining by checking and verifying our relationship with the environment. When we become lost while hiking, it's because the focus of our effort has turned inward. We have not continuously refined that image. We are now relying on our internal narrative. We are effectively bending the map to match the terrain, as opposed to using the terrain to help us orient to the map. Mismatches and inconsistencies are going to occur between our perception of the real world and our presence in the real world. And what we are striving to do as we use the OODA Loop, as we examine our orientation, is to reduce those mismatches, reduce those inconsistencies, but to also use those mismatches and inconsistencies as triggers. They are the flags that we use to identify the need to come back to refine our picture of reality. It is something we have to practice. Spinney then takes time to sort of illuminate Boyd's dialectic, right? And he does this by examining how the Boydian trinity affects and shapes the idea of building snowmobiles. Right? We talked about building snowmobiles back in semester 1. This is the idea that we take a group of things, a group of ideas, of concepts, of objects. We break them down through analysis. We destroy them. We then assemble elements from those various wholes into a new whole creation. So we have gone from the thesis of a water skier, a motorboat, a tractor, these various objects. We have deconstructed those individual theses and hence creating their antithesis. They're not a skier, not a tractor, and these constituent elements are now reassembled into our thesis, the snowmobile, with its skis, its handlebars, its motor, its tracks. With that in mind, we want to consider how the Boydian trinity of Heisenberg, Gödel, and the second law of thermodynamics all imply that. It comes down to this quote: "One cannot determine the character or nature of a system within itself. Moreover, attempts to do so lead to confusion and disorder." Why is this true? Let's start with Gödel. Gödel offers that through the examination of axiomatic systems, and he's principally speaking about mathematics, but looking at axiomatic systems, that we cannot wholly prove an axiomatic system only using the axioms of the system. We have to use ideas that exist outside of the system to validate all of the axioms of the system. This is something that requires spending a little bit of time with, for sure, but ultimately it comes down to this. I can't prove my argument only using the postulates of my argument in the real world. It is only within, let's look at it from a logical standpoint, right? From a position of formal logic, right? So if P, then Q is a common initial statement in deductive logic. If I have P, then I have Q. I have P. Therefore, I have Q. Now, this is an axiomatic system in and of itself, right? It's a proof. And much the same way we have proofs in geometry and in other logical systems, this is a formal logical proof. If I have this, then I have this. I have this, therefore I have this. Okay, cool. But what is not contained within this system is a definition of this if-then relationship. That definition, that explanation, the set of axioms that inform this axiom are not contained within this system. They are contained within a larger system of formal logic. And that, to me, is the easiest way to understand Gödel. It's that we don't have all of the axioms that we use within the limited boundaries of the system that we're examining. So we then come to Heisenberg. We come to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? And the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is, the easiest way to think of it is, if you know where you are, you don't know how fast you're going. And if you know how fast you're going, you don't know where you are. Where I like to think of this is that Heisenberg, the indeterminacy or uncertainty principle, is looking at position, and it's looking at speed. As my velocity changes, the degree of certainty that I have about my position is decreased. As my certainty of my position is clear, my certainty about how fast I'm going is decreased. Basically, think of this in terms of driving. If I look at a map and I say I am here, then I am going 0 miles an hour effectively, right? Because I'm pointing to a single spot, I'm pointing to a snapshot. In terms of where a lot of us are looking at this from complex dynamic environments like social environments, the fireground, things like that, the more precise my definition of what's happening in this single moment is, the picture that I take, the less I understand how things are continuing to evolve. Conversely, if I am rooted mostly in how fast things are going, I don't really know what's happening. Lastly, the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics is the one that says that all systems, all closed systems, invariably proceed towards entropy, towards disorder. And these three things come to explain how it is that the character or nature of a system within it cannot be determined from within itself. What this means is that in order to build snowmobiles, in order to use the Boydian dialectic, we must always be looking outside of our orientation for new information, for unfolding circumstances, for our interaction with the environment, and using that to continually refine and shape our view of reality. We disregard these three concepts that are parallel, and measuring our thought process against them should become an implicit part of our thinking. Spinney uses the term loop in quotes because he wants to come back to the fact that the OODA loop is a model, it is a descriptor. And while it is not his language, I agree with the mathematician George Box, who reminds us that all models are wrong. Some of them are just useful. All models are a way of boundarying a question, boundarying a series of concerns and ideas. And with those boundaries, we gain the capacity to refine our understanding, refine our thinking. So in this way, the OODA loop, to quote Spinney here, is an analytic synthetic interaction by which our mental orientation connects with the external world in an evolving, open-ended, far from equilibrium process governed by control loops embodying positive as well as negative feedback. The entire loop, not just orientation, is an ongoing, many-sided, implicit cross-referencing process of projection, empathy, correlation, and rejection. That's Boyd's words about the loop in particular. It's unpredictable. It is nonlinear. So what this means is that because the OODA loop is describing a nonlinear, dynamic, tempo-dependent process of dialectical thinking, it primes us to recognize and identify novel conditions that we may seize and use those novel conditions to advance our aim of surviving and thriving under our own terms, using those novel conditions to engage in our agenic behavior. And we do that through what I call seizing serendipity. We seize the serendipitous moments that other people miss by using this constantly shaped and shaping system that the OODA loop describes, right? So when things go out of whack, we see new and strange things. That's when we are learning things. If we are obtaining the expected outcomes from a decision and action, there is relatively no learning to be done. It is only when those mismatches occur, when those differences between our expectations and our reality present themselves, that we have the opportunity to come to understand the environment and what is occurring in a better way. We need to come back to the reminder, though, that because there is a nonlinear dynamic relationship here, away from equilibrium, that we are always prone to chaos. We are prone to an increase in the noise to signal ratio that reduces our capacity to make good decisions or understand the environment. With that in mind, I want to take a moment and reflect on something that Hammond says in The Mind of War. Quote, "What I call Boyd's Way, his thought and vision, is a sort of Western Zen, is a state of mind, a learning of the oneness of things. The way is not an end but a process, not a state of mind but a journey." This is a key insight for us. The OODA loop is not normative. It's not explicitly telling us how to think. Rather, it's describing the process that we all use in our thinking. And we can then use that as a normative guide for improving our capacity for independent action by deconstructing our own orientation. Much of what we are going to deal with here in semester 2 is deconstructing orientation, of actively going through and examining not just the filters of orientation, but asking questions about our own filters. This is a difficult process. It's an ongoing process, but it's one that will bear incredibly useful fruit over time. As always, thanks for taking some time out of your day to spend it with me, talking about these ideas and thinking about them. Thank you to the Patreons who make this work possible. Your support is what allows me to invest time and energy to produce this work, and I appreciate your support. We'll see you soon. Cheers.